The Zek'thor Dominion had been expanding across the Perseus Arm for 6 centuries, which was moderately impressive if you overlook the fact that most of their conquests involved threatening pre-spaceflight civilizations and then acting shocked when those civilizations surrendered. War, as practiced by the Zek'thor, was less about actual combat and more about showing up with big ships, flexing metaphorical muscles, and waiting for everyone to acknowledge their superiority. It was theater with better special effects and occasionally some actual casualties. The galaxy had developed a comfortable hierarchy over the millennia. At the top sat the ancient empires, the Zek'thor with their warrior culture, the Medusan collective with their hive mind efficiency, and the architect communion with their insufferable tendency to lecture everyone about proper civic planning. Below them clustered the mid-tier powers, species that had been around long enough to know better but not long enough to stop making the same mistakes. And at the bottom, scrambling around like confused children at an adult's party, were the newcomers. Humanity had crashed into this established order 38 years ago, with all the grace of a drunk elephant at a tea ceremony. They'd shown up in ships that looked like they'd been assembled by optimistic amateurs with a welding torch and a dream, announced themselves to the first alien vessel they encountered, and then proceeded to colonize systems at a pace that made the established powers deeply uncomfortable. Humans didn't follow the rules because nobody had bothered to explain the rules to them, and by the time anyone thought to do so, Earth had already established enough of a foothold that forcibly removing them would be expensive and annoying. General Kavros, then of the Zek'thor 4th Conquest Fleet, represented everything his species valued. He stood 9 feet tall, his obsidian scales were decorated with scars from a dozen campaigns, and his 4 eyes could express contempt in ways that would make a philosophy professor weep with envy. He'd spent 40 years of his life perfecting the art of intimidation, and he was very, very good at his job. His current assignment was, in his professional opinion, beneath him. "Explain to me again," he said to his intelligence officer, his voice carrying the kind of menace usually reserved for funeral dirges, "why the Zek'thor Dominion is negotiating with primates over territorial disputes." Commander Ilix, who'd served under Kavros for 15 years and had developed a healthy appreciation for when to speak and when to shut up, chose his words carefully. "The humans have established settlements in the Threshold Sector, General. Our claim to those systems predates their arrival by 2 centuries, but they're refusing to acknowledge our sovereignty. Then we remove them. This is not complicated. The Galactic Concordat prohibits unprovoked military action against recognized spacefaring civilizations, sir. The humans achieved recognition status 12 years ago. Any offensive action would require Concordat approval, which would take months to obtain and might be denied given the political climate." Kavros made a sound like grinding metal, which was the Zek'thor equivalent of a very long, very tired sigh. "So instead of handling this properly, we're reduced to talking with humans who've been in space for less time than I've been in uniform. Earth's diplomatic corps has requested a formal mediation session. They're sending a representative to the neutral station Echelon Prime. We're obligated under treaty law to attend." Who are they sending? Some admiral. A political official with actual authority. Ilix consulted his data tablet, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. According to their transmission, they're sending Ambassador Kira Chen. Her file indicates 23 years of diplomatic service, specializing in territorial disputes and resource negotiations. 23 years, Kavros repeated slowly. "The humans have been in space for 38 years. This ambassador has spent more than half of humanity's entire spacefaring history doing diplomacy, and we're supposed to believe she's competent. Her record shows successful mediations in 7 prior disputes, sir." "Against whom? Other confused primates?" Kavros stood, his full height making the already intimidating war room feel smaller. "Fine, we'll attend this farce. But make no mistake, Commander, I'm not negotiating with these creatures. I'm informing them of reality, and reality is that the Threshold Sector belongs to the Zek'thor Dominion. If they're intelligent enough to understand that, we avoid unpleasantness. If not, we'll proceed through proper channels and remove them by force in 6 months, when the Concordat approves our petition. And if the Concordat doesn't approve the petition, Kavros smiled, showing far too many teeth. Then we'll discover just how committed the Concordat is to enforcing its own rules. Echelon Prime had been built specifically for situations like this. Disputes that were too serious for subspace communications, but not serious enough to justify starting wars. The station orbited a neutron star in unclaimed space, staffed by a rotating crew of neutral observers from a dozen species, all of whom were professionally dedicated to preventing violence and personally dedicated to counting the days until their assignment ended. The meditation chamber, where Kavros waited, embodied aggressive neutrality. The walls were bare gray metal, the temperature maintained at a compromise that made everyone slightly uncomfortable, and the furniture had been designed by someone who'd never actually sat down before. There were no weapons allowed, no guards permitted beyond the outer corridors, and enough surveillance equipment to make a paranoid dictator feel secure. Kavros had arrived with 6 of his senior officers, all of them decorated veterans who knew how to loom menacingly. They'd positioned themselves around the circular table in a formation that military academies taught as defensive but clearly superior positioning. Behind them, holographic displays showed Zek'thor territorial claims going back 4 centuries, because nothing said, "I'm open to discussion," quite like visual aids, proving you were here first. When the human delegation arrived, Kavros had to actively prevent himself from laughing. She entered alone, not flanked by guards, not accompanied by advisors, not even trailed by some assistant carrying documents. Just one human female, approximately average height for her species, wearing what appeared to be a simple dark blue suit that wouldn't have looked out of place at a corporate meeting. She carried a slim datapad in one hand and a sealed container that his translator identified as containing a beverage Earth humans called tea. Her appearance was entirely unremarkable. Dark hair cut short and practical, brown eyes that showed neither fear nor aggression, features that would blend into any crowd. She moved with quiet efficiency, pulling out a chair across from Kavros and sitting down without ceremony or apparent nervousness. "General then," she said, her voice pleasant and professional. "I'm Ambassador Lyra Chen from the Terran Diplomatic Corps. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "I agreed to nothing," Kavros said, loading his voice with the contempt he usually reserved for incompetent subordinates. "Your government demanded this session. I'm attending because the Concordat's bureaucratic maze requires it. Don't mistake compliance with cooperation." "Noted," Lyra said, opening her datapad and making a quick notation. "Before we begin, can I confirm we're discussing competing territorial claims in the Threshold sector, specifically systems designated Threshold 7, Threshold 12, and Threshold 19. Those are Zek'thor designations for Zek'thor systems that your species has illegally occupied. We call them by their proper names, Kelvaros, Thenium, and Darkstar Station." "Interesting. We call them New Vancouver, Hope's End, and Prosperity Station. It's almost like naming things doesn't actually confer ownership." Lyra pulled up a star chart on the shared holographic display. According to Concordat law, territorial claims require one of 3 conditions: historical settlement, active resource exploitation, or strategic necessity properly filed with the Territorial Commission. "Let's examine which of these apply to your claim." Kavros leaned forward, using his considerable size advantage to create physical intimidation. "Our claim is historical. The Krag'thar Dominion surveyed these systems 217 years ago. We established unmanned monitoring stations. We've had continuous surveillance presence ever since. These facts are documented and filed with the Concordat." "Correct," Lyra agreed calmly. "You surveyed them. You even left some automated probes behind. What you didn't do is settle them, develop them, or demonstrate any active interest in their resources until humans showed up and started building colonies. That's not a territorial claim, General. That's galactic stamp collecting." One of Kavros's officers made a hissing sound that signaled offense. Kavros held up one clawed hand for silence, keeping his 4 eyes fixed on the human. "You dare mock Zek'thor sovereignty?" "I'm not mocking anything. I'm pointing out that under Concordat law, which your government signed and ratified 93 years ago. Surveillance alone doesn't establish territorial rights. Active development does. Humans have been actively developing these systems for 6 years. We've established permanent settlements, totaling 47,000 colonists across the 3 systems. We've built infrastructure, initiated resource extraction, and filed all appropriate documentation with the Territorial Commission after we had already claimed them. You claimed surveillance rights, which we're not disputing. You can keep your monitoring stations. We'll even provide you with regular reports on our activities if you want. But surveillance rights and territorial sovereignty are 2 different things, and you know it. Kavros felt his scales shift to a darker shade, which was the Zek'thori equivalent of flushing with anger. This is sophistry. Legal manipulation. The threshold sector falls within the traditional Zek'thori sphere of influence. Traditional sphere of influence isn't a legal category. Lyra interrupted, her voice still maddeningly pleasant. It's a concept you made up because it sounds impressive. Show me where in the Concordat Charter it mentions spheres of influence. The spirit of the law. General, I've spent 2 decades studying the letter of the law, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the spirit of the law is what people invoke when the letter of the law doesn't support their position. The Concordat operates on documented claims, not vibes. The room had gone very quiet. Kavros's officers were staring at Lyra with expressions that ranged from shock to something that might have been grudging respect. No one spoke to General Kavros then like this. Conquering heroes didn't get lectured on legal technicalities by species that still thought space travel was exciting. You're playing a dangerous game, Ambassador, Kavros said quietly. The Zek'thor Dominion has military resources that dwarf your entire fleet. We could remove your colonies in a matter of days. You could try, Lyra acknowledged. It would violate the Concordat's prohibition on military action against recognized settlements, which would result in sanctions, trade embargoes, and potential military intervention by other Concordat members. But sure, you could try. The question is whether removing some human farmers and miners is worth becoming a galactic pariah. She took a sip of her tea, completely unbothered by the implied threat. Here's what I think is really happening. The Zek'thor Dominion surveyed dozens of systems in this region 2 centuries ago, because survey missions are cheap and make you look expansionist. You planned to eventually develop them, but eventually kept getting pushed back because you had other priorities. Then humans showed up, looked at your survey markers, shrugged, and started building colonies because we didn't know we were supposed to be intimidated by your historical claims. Now you're in the awkward position of either challenging us legally, which you'll probably lose, or challenging us militarily, which would be expensive and politically damaging. So instead, you're hoping you can intimidate me into abandoning our colonies so you can save face. Am I close? Kavros didn't respond immediately. He was running combat algorithms in his head, trying to find the angle where he'd regain control of this conversation. The humans shouldn't have been able to counter him so effectively. She was small, physically weak, from a species barely out of its infancy. Yet she sat across from him like she belonged here, dismantling his arguments with the efficiency of a seasoned strategist. Your analysis is insulting, he finally said. My analysis is accurate, Lyra corrected. And accuracy is more important than politeness in negotiations. Look, General, I understand your position. You're a military leader, probably with a distinguished record. You're used to solving problems through strength and intimidation. Those are valuable skills, in the right context. This isn't the right context. Then what would you suggest, Ambassador? Since you clearly believe you understand this situation better than I do, I suggest we find a solution where both sides get something they actually need, rather than fighting over symbolic victories neither side really wants. Lyra expanded the star chart, highlighting the 3 from Rand disputed systems. Threshold 7, or New Vancouver as we call it, is primarily agricultural. Threshold 12 is rich in rare earth minerals. Threshold 19 is a logistics hub. What does the Zek'thor Dominion actually need from these systems? We need recognition of our sovereign rights. No, You need something practical. Sovereignty is abstract. What's the concrete benefit you're after? Strategic positioning, resource access, military installations. What's the actual goal here? Kavros hesitated. It was a good question, which irritated him because he should have been asking it first. The truth was that the Zek'thar Dominion didn't particularly need the threshold sector. It was peripheral to their core territories. The resources were useful but not critical, and the strategic value was minimal. But they'd claimed it first, and allowing humans to simply ignore those claims would set a dangerous precedent. We require, he said carefully, assurance that our historical claims are respected. That human expansion doesn't simply disregard established territorial markers. That there are consequences for ignoring Zek'thari sovereignty. So it's about precedent and respect, not the actual systems. Both. Everything. Okay, that's something I can work with. Lyra made notes on her datapad. Here's a proposal. The Terran Federation formally acknowledges Zek'thari priority claims in the threshold sector. We recognize that you were here first and that our colonization proceeded without proper consultation. We agree to negotiate future expansion in adjacent sectors with your government before establishing new settlements. That's the respect component. And the practical component. We maintain our existing colonies, but agree to joint resource development in Threshold 12. Your corporations get 40% ownership of mining operations, we get 60%. We also grant you permanent docking rights at Threshold 19, making it a shared logistics hub. You get tangible benefits, we keep our colonists, everyone wins something concrete. Kavros studied the human carefully. You'd give us nearly half of the mining rights. The alternative is spending the next 5 years in legal battles, where neither of us can develop those resources, then probably ending up with a concordat ruling that splits them anyway. I'd rather skip the expensive part and go straight to the compromise. This is assuming I believe you have authority to offer such terms. I have full negotiating authority from the Terran Federation. Council, Lyra said, pulling up her credentials on the display. Every offer I make is binding. Do you have the same authority, General? Or do you need to consult with your government? It was a pointed question. Kavros did have authority to negotiate, but he hadn't expected to need it. He'd assumed this would be a simple matter of informing the humans of reality and watching them capitulate. Instead, he was being offered a compromise that was actually more generous than what he'd expected to extract through intimidation. Your offer has merit, he admitted grudgingly. But the terms require refinement. 40% mining rights is insufficient given our priority claim. We require 55%. 55% for doing zero development work while we establish all the infrastructure? No. 45% is my ceiling, and that's generous, considering you've had 2 centuries to develop these resources and chose not to. 50%. Equal partnership. 47.5%, and you get tax incentives on resource exports for the first 5 years. Kavros felt something shift in the conversation. They were actually negotiating now, not posturing. The human had somehow maneuvered him from a position of absolute demand to genuine compromise without him noticing exactly when it happened. I need military basing rights at Threshold 19, he said. Not just docking facilities, actual, tactical installations. Limited defensive installations, maximum of 1 battalion, no offensive capability that could threaten the colony populations. 1 battalion. That's barely a garrison. It's 1 battalion more than you have there now, General. Take the win. They went back and forth for another hour, trading concessions and compromises. Lyra negotiated with the precision of a surgeon and the flexibility of a gymnast, always finding a middle ground that gave both sides something concrete. When Kavros pushed too hard, she pushed back with legal precedents and practical consequences. When he made reasonable requests, she accommodated them without unnecessary resistance. What disturbed Kavros most was realizing he'd underestimated her completely. He'd walked into this meeting, expecting to intimidate a naive human into surrender. Instead, he was engaged in the most challenging negotiation of his career, against someone who understood concordat law better than most judges and could navigate political complexity with skills that would shame veteran diplomats from ancient civilizations. You studied Zenthari contract law, he observed during a brief pause. Your citations of our legal traditions are too accurate to be improvised. I studied everything I could find about Zenthari culture, legal systems, military doctrine, and negotiation tactics, Lyra confirmed. I spent 6 months preparing for this meeting. I learned your language, read your military histories, analyzed 14 previous territorial negotiations your government conducted, and studied your personal career record. General, why would you invest such effort for a minor territorial dispute? Because nothing is minor if you let it escalate. And because understanding your perspective is the only way to find solutions you'll accept. She paused, taking another sip of tea. You know what I learned about you, General? You've commanded the 4th Conquest Fleet for 19 years, you've won 7 major campaigns, negotiated 4 successful surrenders, and have a reputation for brutally efficient problem-solving. You're also known for actually honoring agreements once you make them, which is rarer than it should be among military leaders. You researched my personal history? Of course I did. How else would I know how to negotiate with you? You value strength and respect, you respond poorly to deception, and you appreciate efficiency. So I'm being direct, showing you I've done my homework, and offering you real benefits rather than trying to trick you into accepting symbolic victories. This is how you negotiate with someone you respect. Kavros felt his scales shift color again, but this time it wasn't anger. The human had shown him more professional respect than most of his fellow Zenthari officers. She'd taken him seriously enough to invest months of preparation, understood his perspective well enough to anticipate his objections, and offered him genuine compromises rather than patronizing concessions. The Zenthari Dominion, he said slowly, has underestimated humanity. Most species do. We're new, we're small, we make mistakes, and we don't always understand the rules. But we learn fast, General. We adapt, we study, and we don't give up. What would have happened if I'd refused to negotiate? If I'd simply issued an ultimatum? Lyra smiled, and for the first time Kavros saw something hard behind her pleasant demeanor. Then I would have tied you up in legal proceedings for the next 5 years, while our colonies grew larger and more established. I would have filed complaints with the Territorial Commission documenting every Zenthari action in the sector. I would have lobbied other Concordat members to support human settlement rights. I would have made removing us so politically and legally expensive that your government would have eventually decided it wasn't worth the effort. And I would have done it all while remaining perfectly polite and procedurally correct, because humans are very good at being annoying within the rules. That's not strength. That's manipulation. No, General, that's diplomacy. Strength is one tool among many. Sometimes it's the right tool. Sometimes it's not. The skill is knowing which tool to use when. They continued negotiating for another 3 hours, finalizing terms on resource sharing, military access, trade agreements, and procedural frameworks for resolving future disputes. By the time they finished, Kavros had to admit that the final agreement was better than anything he could have imposed through military pressure. Humans kept their colonies, Zenthari gained substantial economic and strategic benefits, and both sides established a framework for cooperation rather than conflict. When Lyra stood to leave, she extended her hand in the human gesture of respect. Kavros looked at it for a moment, then carefully wrapped one of his clawed hands around hers. Her grip was surprisingly firm for someone so physically fragile. I apologize, Ambassador, for my initial assessment of your capabilities. No apology necessary, General. First impressions are hard to overcome. I looked at you and saw a military leader who'd probably try to intimidate me. You looked at me and saw a soft primate who'd fold under pressure. We were both operating on incomplete information. Yet you were more prepared than I was. I had more to prove, Lyra said simply. You have centuries of Zenthari dominance backing your credibility. I have 38 years of human spaceflight and a reputation for being the new kids who don't know what they're doing. So yes, I overprepared. I always do. After she left, Kavros stood alone in the negotiation chamber, surrounded by his officers who were too professional to comment on what had just transpired. Commander Ilix approached cautiously. "General, your assessment of the agreement? Acceptable. More than acceptable, actually. We gained significant concessions while avoiding a protracted legal battle or military confrontation." Kavros deactivated the holographic displays. "The human outmaneuvered us, Commander. She understood our position better than we understood hers, prepared more thoroughly, and negotiated from a position of knowledge rather than assumption. She's just one diplomat, sir. Surely not representative of their entire species." "That's what concerns me," Kavros said quietly. "If one human diplomat with 2 decades of experience can conduct negotiations at this level, what will they be capable of in another century? Another 1,000 years? They're still physically weak, sir. Militarily inferior. Physical strength is becoming less relevant in galactic politics, Commander. The humans understand something we've forgotten. In a galaxy bound by laws and treaties, legal expertise and diplomatic skill are forms of power. They're weaponizing cooperation, and we don't have effective defenses against it." 3 months later, the Threshold Accords were formally ratified by both governments. They became a template for subsequent human territorial negotiations across the Perseus Arm. Ambassador Lyra Chen negotiated 9 more major agreements over the next 12 years before being appointed as Earth's representative to the Galactic Concordat itself. General Kavros then never publicly discussed what happened during that first negotiation, but his subsequent reports to Zenthari High Command included detailed analyses of human diplomatic capabilities and recommendations to take them seriously as political actors. Several of his fellow generals ignored these warnings and learned the same lesson the hard way. The Zenthari Dominion continued expanding across the galaxy, but they stopped assuming that military might was the only form of power worth respecting. Other ancient civilizations made similar adjustments, some faster than others. The galaxy's comfortable hierarchy became less comfortable as humans demonstrated that being new didn't mean being naive, and being small didn't mean being weak. Humanity continued doing what humanity did best: adapting, learning, and finding creative solutions to problems that everyone else had decided were unsolvable. They negotiated when they could, fought when they must, and always did their homework. The established powers eventually realized what Kavros had discovered in that negotiation chamber. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers or their military capacity. It was their absolute refusal to accept that youth and inexperience meant inferiority. They looked at a galaxy of ancient empires and 1,000-year-old civilizations and thought, "We can learn from them. We can understand them. We can compete with them." And most terrifying of all, they were usually right. The universe, it turned out, didn't care how long your species had been spacefaring. It only cared about whether you could adapt to new challenges. The Zenthari had been adapting for millennia, but they'd been adapting slowly, incrementally, with the confidence of those who believed time was on their side. Humans adapted like their lives depended on it, because they understood something the ancient powers had forgotten. In a changing galaxy, the species that learns fastest survives longest. General Kavros then had commanded fleets, conquered systems, and defeated enemies across a dozen campaigns. But sitting across from one human diplomat with a data pad and a cup of tea had taught him something more valuable than any military victory. Never, ever underestimate someone just because they're new to the game. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who hasn't learned yet that they're supposed to be afraid.